Hello, everyone. I decided that I would like to take this opportunity to dive in with a semi-controversial topic of getting into the battle among the battle of the adaptation, shall we say, between the 2005 and the 1995 Pride and Prejudice. And I've chosen, I think, a controversial title of Why I Hate Pride and Prejudice 2005. So, if Pride and Prejudice 2005 is your favorite and you don't want to hear me nitpick all sorts of things about it, this is probably not the video for you. If you would love to hear the commentary of why or what bothers me about this movie, stick around. I will let you know. So, first off, my disclaimers. This whole video is all just opinions and not statements of facts. Obviously, this is just my opinion of the movie. It is not a statement of fact of anything. I am not a movie expert. I am not a Jane Austen expert. I am just a big fan. I'm not a British history expert. All of the things. I am a fan who just likes to talk about these things. And also, don't let me yuck your yum. If you love this movie, don't let me ruin that for you. That is not the point of this. The point of this is that I get great enjoyment out of nitpicking things that I don't like about this movie because I am such a Jane Austen fan and freak. And so this is enjoyable for me to nitpick all these little things that bug me about this movie. That is part of my personality. It might not be the healthiest thing, but I like it. I enjoy it. That's why I'm doing this. If this is not enjoyable for you to hear me nitpick this movie, again, please move along. Don't let me yuck your yum. Don't let me ruin this for you. That is not the point, and that is not my goal. More power to you. Continue watching this with my blessings, and let us move on. I also want to point out my personal biases, which is the 1995 version is the first version I ever saw. I fell in love with it. I was introduced to Pride and Prejudice for the first time when I was a freshman in high school. It was one of my required readings, and we watched some, if not, I don't think we watched all of it, but we would definitely watch some of the 1995 version in the classroom. I ended up buying the DVDs. I've watched it 10 million times. Colin Firth is my Darcy forever and always. I will not apologize about that. 1995 is the superior version. Fight me. They're very different mediums. It's not, the 1995 is a miniseries, not a movie. There's all sorts of things. But 1995 Pride and Prejudice is the ultimate version, in my opinion. And so the 2005 had a lot to live up to try and be even partially compared to the 1995. And in my opinion, of course, did not win. So we're going to be talking all about that. And I do point that out because I do think that which one you saw first and which one you sort of imprinted on is important over what you think, what visions come to mind when I'm reading the book, the characters from the 1995 or the actors from the 1995 are the faces that I see in my head. Um, the 1995 version is the one that is sort of embedded in me, not the 2005. And that is important, and it definitely changes how you view these things. So it is just something I wanted to lay out there before we get into it. Now, first, a little story of the watching 2005 Pride and Prejudice for the first time. As I've already said, I was introduced to Pride and Prejudice as a freshman in high school. I was obsessed with the 1995 version and with the book, all of that. When I was in college is when the 2005 version came out. Would have been, I think, a freshman in college at the time. It was about 4-ish years later. And so I was super excited about it. I watched all the trailers. I watched a bunch of comment or like interviews that were coming about it. The internet is not what it is, so there was not the amount of media ahead of time as there would be now, at least that I found or had access to. But I was super excited about it. My mom and I went and saw it in theaters. I believe opening weekend or very soon after it came out. Probably not opening day, but very close. I was super excited to go see it. And I got my mom to go with me, and we went, and my mom knew how excited I was about it. So as we were leaving the theater, she's, turning to me like, "Oh, how'd you like it?" And she's all happy about it. And my initial just reaction was kind of meh. It was just okay, I guess. I just remember looking at her and not really having anything to say one way or the other. I'd only seen it the one time, obviously, in theaters, and I had not processed enough to really be able to say like why I didn't have a positive reaction to it. But my immediate emotional reaction was not positive. I just came out feeling very mediocre, middle of the road. I couldn't really express why. And I've now had 20 years to think about it. This is now 2025. So I thought it was a good time to now really go through some of the reasons that it did not hit me the way I wanted it to, and some of the things that always bug me about this movie. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So, I like to try and sandwich good and bad. So, we're going to start with positives because this movie is not all the way terrible, even though I've said I hate it. I have watched it many times. I own the DVD. I bought the DVD after not liking it in the theaters. Um, and I still have it, even though like who watches DVDs anymore? But that's besides the point. I have a Jane Austen DVD collection anyway, and this is part of it, and I'm not going to throw it away or anything. And I do throw it on. I think it's great as like a background noise or background music and sound that's going on while I'm doing other things, which I'm a big fan of. I don't like the house to be silent. I like to be playing music or movies or something. And I do think that this movie is great for that purpose. I just don't like to actually sit and like watch and pay attention to it. But it is great as background noise and background visuals even. And so that's the first thing that comes up, the music. The music and the soundtrack of this movie is great. I love the soundtrack. A lot of the music is fantastic. No notes, it's fabulous. What I'm calling the pastoral vibes. I don't know if that's the correct thing to say, but as you can see from the picture I've chosen here, some of the landscape views are gorgeous. This is from when Elizabeth is on the cliff when she's near Pemberley up in Derbyshire somewhere. And, the wind is blowing her skirt, and it's just very pretty. They've got some beautiful, like, landscape views outside. I'm not a huge fan of what that looks like on the inside, which is why I said pastoral views, because inside the houses, I think, is problematic most of the time. But the outdoors views that they show, chef's kiss, amazing. Love it. I have to throw an honorable mention in for Kitty, the actress who plays Kitty in this version. I think she's fabulous. She's a great Kitty. I love her a lot. Um, and I love that actress as she grows up and does other things as well. She was in a beautiful episode of Doctor Who, which I love. So I love her. She's the best. Gotta love Kitty in this version. I also really love the actress who plays Jane in this version. She's fabulous. This version of Jane is great. Again, no notes. She's wonderful. Love her. I wish I could say the same for Elizabeth, but I don't love Elizabeth as much. It's, in my opinion, Kitty and Jane are the highlights as far as the Bennett sisters go in this version. They're my favorites. So, having gotten the positives out of the way, here we go into the things that I hate. So, the first one I want to talk about is the hair. The hair in this movie is so bad. Mr. Darcy's hair is awful. Elizabeth's hair is god awful all of the time. Even though I love Kitty. I already talked about loving Kitty. Um, Kitty and Lydia's hair is just horrible. Everybody's hair is always disheveled and out of place. And I have a picture on my slide here of all the Bennett sisters at the Netherfield Ball, or right after the Netherfield Ball the next morning when they're waiting for their carriage, I believe was when this picture's from. And you can see how they wore their hair to a ball. So this is the fanciest hair they're supposed to have. And three of the sisters have their hair down. Like, what? They would never. Why do they have their hair down? Why do they have modern bangs? That's not a thing. I know that this version is not set in the same exact time period as all the others, and specifically the 1995. They on purpose set it a little bit earlier in the 1790s because that's when Jane Austen wrote Pride and Prejudice. So it was published in 1813, which is when most of the adaptations set it in like the 1810s. But this version is saying that she wrote it back in the 1790s, so they're going to set it there. I think there was also an idea that the director didn't love the Empire Waste and so didn't want to be as stuck with it, which I don't like because I love an Empire Waistline, so that's dumb. But I think there was a thought of that he didn't particularly like that particular aesthetic, so he wanted to set it a little bit earlier so he didn't have to live with that aesthetic, which I can accept as a choice. I don't particularly like that choice, but it is choices were made, and I'm not mad necessarily about the time frame they put it in. But even in that time frame, having your hair down like that and more modern bangs are just not the vibe. It really pulled me out of it. Everybody's hair, almost everybody's hair, I feel like was always so disheveled and bad, and I don't understand why that was done. The hair is just awful and it always distracts me from other things that are going on. It pulls me out of the sort of fantasy of the time period, just how bad everybody's hair is. So that is honestly probably my biggest gripe when I'm watching this movie. I hate the hair, especially Elizabeth's hair. I think she's wearing a wig through this whole thing, and it's a really bad wig. She's got weird little like neck bangs on the back of her head. I, I don't know. I could go on and on, but the hair is just bad. I don't like it. It bothers me. So that is one thing that I do not like. My next critique, the Bennets being poor. This version, I think, really leans into that the Bennets are poor, and that is the problem. And I think part of that is that they're trying to simplify it, especially for an American audience. They didn't think that we were, I don't know, with it enough to understand class distinctions in the same way. So they really just made it all down to money. And I don't like that they did that because that's kind of that simplification. I feel like that we can get what class means. Like the class distinction is separate from money distinctions. Because the Bennets aren't poor. They're very wealthy. They're not as wealthy as Darcy and they're not as wealthy as Bingley, but they're wealthy. The problem is not that they are poor currently. The problem is that the daughters can't inherit the money that they currently have. So the money that their family currently has cannot be left to them when their father dies. So the mom and the sisters are all looking at being poor in the future because they cannot retain their father's wealth. That's the problem. The problem is not that they don't have money now. And so I think it was a choice made to simplify, again, specifically for an American audience, this idea of class. And they thought that that was too complicated, that we wouldn't understand it. And I think that just dumbs it down. And I think you need to trust your audience a little bit more than that. And I think we could understand the concept of class without like specifically seeing the Bennets as this poor family. Like that, I don't think that was necessary. I think it's a misunderstanding of the story. And it just kind of bothers me. I don't like that that choice was made. So that bothers me. Another thing that is an aesthetic thing is the lack of bonnets. They do use bonnets every once in a while in this movie, but a lot of times, especially Lizzie, is wandering around without a bonnet. And I love a bonnet. I think it's great. Again, I saw a interview with the director. The director doesn't like bonnets. I think bonnets can be hard to shoot, just from a technical perspective. If they like shade the face, it causes problems when you're doing a movie set and things. But I'm really sad that they just decided to go anti-bonnet. And again, with the hair being so disheveled all the time, and when they do have bonnets, they're like falling off the back of their heads. And it's just, it adds to the sort of a whole disheveled vibe of this whole movie that I don't love. So the lack of bonnets, not a fan. I've already sort of touched on this, but the lack of Empire waistlines. Same thing, it's an aesthetic thing. They did it on purpose. I think some of the dresses in this movie are gorgeous. Some of them really are not. I will talk about one specifically later. Um, but it is a personal taste thing. I still don't love that they changed the time period and changed the clothes. I love the Regency look. I love the Empire waistline. I wish that that was being, I don't know. I wish that that was here. I don't approve of that choice. I've already gone through it, but that is one of the things that bugs me about this movie, just the pure aesthetics of that. The next thing I would like to talk about is the pig. If you've seen this movie, you probably know where the pig falls. There is a scene in this movie where there is a giant pig like wandering through the house for some reason. Makes no sense. There's no reason for it other than to try and make them seem, I don't know, maybe poor, déclassé or something. Like a rich, fancy person wouldn't have a pig walking through their house. Like, I don't understand the thought process of why there's a pig walking through the house. And as far as I know historically, being not a historian and not an expert on this at all, there's no reason that a family of the Bennett standing would have a pig wandering through their house. Um, and then, but it's this kind of extended scene. I don't actually know how long it is, but it feels like it's a couple minutes of this pig wandering through and Mrs. Bennet staring strangely at the pig and the pig's balls. And it's a whole thing, and I don't understand why that scene is there, especially with how rushed the rest of the movie seems to be. They rush through other plot points like crazy. And yet we have this extended scene of a pig for no reason, and I don't get why that choice was made. The pig scene bothers me. I don't get it. Okay, the entire erasure of societal norms, also a problem. Like, why does society not exist in this version of the movie or in this version, this adaptation? It really lowers the stakes. Like, it's set in a time period, and Jane Austen really only works in the time period that it was written. If you try to make a modern adaptation, you have to make changes to a lot of things because the societal the societal stuff, the stakes just aren't as big in a modern time, right? If a woman doesn't get married in modern day America, she can have a job and she can survive, and she might want to be married and have kids, but it's not like she's going to be destitute if she doesn't. Jane Austen and her stakes of her stories are really based on the societal expectations and norms of the time, which means that the Bennet sisters cannot go out and get a job, cannot support themselves, have to be married, but also that like what they are allowed to do is very restricted. Jane is not allowed to write to Mr. Bingley because that would be completely inappropriate. That's why she can only write to his sister. Jane cannot go visit Mr. Bingley and talk to him specifically. That would be completely inappropriate. She can only go visit his sister. Like things like that, of just like what the restrictions that are on these young girls, young ladies, of what they're allowed to do in the world is a big part of how the story even works. Because, in a modern day context, Jane can just text Bingley and be like, "Where are you? What's going on?" Or even just tell him I love you. Like the reason that Jane can't talk to him as openly and like tell him how she's feeling is also based on the societal expectations of the time. And this movie sort of keeps that in the sense to try and keep the story going, but also erases them completely and has men and women in the rooms alone together and like just completely Elizabeth Bennet acting in ways that are completely inappropriate, which completely changes her character because Elizabeth Bennet is a very socially acceptable person. That's kind of the point. You show the difference between Jane and Elizabeth, who understand how society works and are able to be quote unquote good societal ladies, versus Kitty and Lydia, who are not able to do that, who show themselves to be lower class by not understanding those social nuances and having all these problems. And so it is important to keep if you're going to do a period piece real adaptation of this story, you need to keep those societal expectations in place or none of it works because the stakes are completely gone without those societal expectations. And it just completely falls apart, in my opinion. So I feel like throughout the movie, they kind of ditch that. It doesn't give you that same level of like understanding of what these stakes of this story actually are. And that's a problem for me. Another thing is the statues. So in this version, when you go to Pemberley, there is a bust of Mr. Darcy, which I have placed here by the pig on my slide, and there he has a whole like statue museum thing in Pemberley, and it's just such a weird choice. Again, in the book and in other adaptations, it was a painting of Mr. Darcy, which is a very common, normal thing that you would have had in these houses. that these wealthy people like Mr. Darcy would have had, like as just a matter of course, it would have happened. He would have had it in his house. His parents would have had it, would have set it up for him when he was a young man. Um, but a statue, like who has a freaking bust of themselves in their house? That's so weird. And also, like, just having a statue garden thing in his house. It's part of the whole I don't really love this version of Pemberley because this version of Pemberley is gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but it's so ostentatious and like over the top. And Pemberley is supposed to be beautiful and grand, but also homey. And Elizabeth is like, I could live here. And she's walking through what looks to be a museum. I don't get the feel like I could live here. And that bothers me. So I don't like the choice of changing the paintings to the statues. I'm sure they did it because of the house that was actually chosen has this statue thing, and so they thought it would be a cool place to film, but it really doesn't work for me. And I really, really dislike the scene where she gets kind of left behind by her aunt and uncle and the housekeeper in the statue room, staring at the bust of Mr. Darcy. Going back to the erasure of social norms, like what in the world are you doing, even by today's standards, leaving someone like this who is a stranger in this house that when you don't know them, like the housekeeper is gonna get freaking fired for leaving people just randomly wandering the halls, especially when Elizabeth is able to then go wander into the family rooms and sees Darcy greeting Georgiana. Like that makes absolutely no sense. Again, the housekeeper is going to get fired. She is supposed to be taking care of these guests and not letting them wander into places where they could steal things or, bug the people who live there, the Darcys. Like it's really weird. And then also the aunt and uncle, like you came together to this home and then you're just gonna like ditch her there. It's so strange to me. But I'll talk more about that in a minute. More things that are problematic. The lack of sense shown by so many characters. Again, it's just like this, it doesn't make sense, is what I mean by this. So many of these things that are happening do not make sense. For example, the proposal scene, the first proposal of Darcy proposing to Elizabeth in the rain in that weird gazebo on the hill. How did he happen to, why are they both out wandering in the rain, first of all? Elizabeth shouldn't, like, she ran, like, the scene before that, she ran from church, maybe? So, another thing that doesn't make sense. So, she has this whole conversation with Colonel Fitzwilliam that she's supposed to have, like, out on a walk. She instead has it in the church during a church service with them, like, talking back and forth in the church. Doesn't make any sense. It's weird. I mean, maybe church was different back then, but it just seems like an odd choice for them to make that choice to have that conversation in the church for some reason. And then she runs away from church, which again, what in the world is she doing? Why is she running from church? But then Darcy, so, like, does he follow her from the church and like stalk her through the rain, like run after her up the hill? And if he did that, how does she not notice? If he didn't, how did he find her? Somehow they're both out running up a hill in the rain to this weird gazebo. It's such a strange idea. I don't get how he finds her there. When Darcy delivers the letter later, is he a ghost? Like, how is he, again, with getting rid of all the societal expectations? He's alone in the room with her. She's basically naked by Regency standards. Like, she's in her freaking pajamas. Why is she dressed like that and out in the living room, or like, no, they wouldn't have called it a living room, but out in a public room of this house, of the Collins's house. She's not in her bedroom. She's out in like a public room, in basically naked, completely inappropriately. Darcy is allowed to come in and see her like that. And then he hands her a note and they're all alone talking, and then he like just disappears. Like the way they filmed that scene where she turns around and he's just gone. So strange. I don't understand what the thought process or what they're trying to get from that, but it like Darcy just disappears and it's like suddenly there's some weird like fantasy elements in this, and I'm not sure. I think Darcy might not have actually been there and maybe Elizabeth is just going crazy. I don't know what's happening, but that scene is super strange. Like going back to the gardeners abandoning their niece at Pemberley, like first they leave her alone in the statue room, which is completely inappropriate on their part and the housekeeper's part. She wanders around the house and into the private rooms of Darcy and his sister and sees them both and then runs away. And then Darcy follows her and doesn't have anything to say about the fact that she's wandering alone in his home. That's so much weirder than running into her the way he does in other adaptations and in the book, where she's obviously on a guided tour with a member of his staff with her and her aunt and uncle. In this version, that's not what's happening. Like, he finds her just roaming around his house by herself. That's weird. And then, even if we take the societal like connotations out of it, her aunt and uncle rode with her in a carriage like 3 miles to the Pemberley estate, across country that Elizabeth does not know. And then they just left her there and they went back to the inn. So she is now by herself at an estate in an area she is not familiar with, having to walk back about 3 miles to the inn, and it's getting dark. Like, it's dark by the time she gets back. Even in a modern day context, I would be so upset if the people who like drove me somewhere just left me there to walk back without like arranging it ahead of time and stuff. That is so weird. Doesn't make any sense. What in the world are they trying to even do? Why would that choice be made? That makes no sense. At the end, how did they find each other on the field of mist? Did they text to meet up? It's just so strange that how did they both know to like go out? Like, it's a very aesthetically pleasing misty scene where they're walking through, but again, societal expectations. They're both essentially naked by Regency standards. They're both, neither of them are formally attired. Elizabeth especially looks like she's in her friggin' pajamas. And they meet in this mist and they have their little romantic thing where she says your hands are cold, which is not romantic, and I hate that line, but I don't even think that made my list of things that I don't like. But it is. It's one of the things I don't like. Oh, your hands are cold. So dumb. Anyway, um, but the fact that they find each other in this field at dawn in the mist. How did that happen? How did they figure that out? How did they just randomly wind up there? Was he planning to walk to Longbourn? Was she walking to Netherfield? Like, what is going on? I don't understand. It makes no sense. And then they come back to the house first thing in the morning dressed like that, and there's not talk of a scandal. Again, her entire family would be like, oh my God, you guys just had sex in a field. Like, what are you doing? It's completely inappropriate. If anybody saw them, the scandal, she'd be completely ruined. It's horrifying, and the fact that nobody seems to care or think that it's any big deal is just dumb. Again, throwing societal expectations out the window. It makes absolutely no sense. And then the ending scene that I believe is only on the American version, but I've never seen the British version, so this is all just rumors I've heard online. But they have that scene where they're sitting again, throwing out societal expectations in their pajamas. They're basically in their underwear, out on the patio at Pemberley, post-coital, I'm assuming, kissing and being all lovebirdy, sitting on like a table or something. It looked like a marble slab of some kind. It didn't look comfortable. But just the way that house is set up, I don't think that that's like a private terrace. I mean, I know it's his house and he can do what he wants, but those houses have so many servants. And there's a lot of people there, and his sister might be there. I mean, maybe she's not yet, but like they wouldn't be walking around like that to a public area and then sitting around kissing like that. Like, that should have been in their freaking bedroom or at least a private like family room of some kind. Why are they outside and like doing that? It's so weird. For sort of propriety of the time. But even besides that, the scene is just like Mrs. Darcy, Mrs. Darcy, Mrs. Darcy. I guess I don't know. It's trying to be romantic. I feel like it's trying too hard. I don't like it. It doesn't work for me. I do agree we need a scene after the Mr. Bennet scene. And, I don't think, from what I understand, if you don't have that ending scene, they just ended it there and people didn't like that, which I agree. I don't feel like ending it with him laughing in his office is a good way to end the movie. But I don't like this ending scene either. I think we need something else, whether it's, my favorite version, if I bring it back to the 95, has the wedding scene, which I think works beautifully. They could have had a wedding scene. They could have even had a similar scene to this, but the two of them like walking around Pemberley or sitting in their bedroom even, or something. I don't know. Just like this just doesn't work for me. I don't like the ending scene. It bugs me. Another thing to think that they made a big change and it was an active on purpose change was the lack of tension between the Bennets. And I mean specifically between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, but also just among the sisters. Like they made a point of making this family more, they said in the thing in the sort of preview thing I watched, more relatable, more familial. But they made the sisters all seem a little bit closer. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet don't hate each other as much as they do in other versions and in the book, in my interpretation anyway. And I don't like it. They got rid of a lot of that tension between all these characters and made them a more loving, basic family, which I mean, I guess it's fine, but I don't like it. I I think it's a change from the book, from other versions um of this story, and I don't quite get why it was necessary to do that. Elizabeth is a judgy person and she judges her younger sisters very harshly. And I guess I don't see why that's problematic. And it's very clear, at least to me in the book, that like Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are not a good match. And that's kind of the point. So to have them also have these weird little like there's a whole scene where they're kind of lovey-dovey in bed together and it's gross and I don't like it and I don't get why we have it. Um yeah, I don't like that they changed the whole dynamic of the Bennet family, in my opinion. I also want to talk about Miss Bingley's dress at the Netherfield Ball. I have a picture here on the slide. If you can see it, you can see Elizabeth's awful hair at the ball again because she's in this picture. But Caroline, Miss Bingley, is wearing spaghetti straps. And she's wearing an empire waist. So the dress with the empire waist part I like, but she should have had at least little cap sleeves or something. Like, what is with the spaghetti straps? It's such a strange choice. The dress looks way modern. It looks like it looks like a prom dress, except for that it's white. Maybe a more modern wedding dress almost. I don't know. But something about it just looks way too modern. It doesn't look like any time period. And I don't understand the choice to have anyone in a time period, like a not quite Regency, but just a little before Regency era movie wear spaghetti straps? Such a strange choice. I don't get it. And her dress always bugs me. All right, more things. Now I want to talk about characterizations, specific characterizations that I think miss the mark. So these are characters who don't make sense. So I've got Charlotte's exposition of I'm 27 years old and I'm frightened. I know a lot of other people seem to like it. That quote ends up on birthday cakes and I see it in memes all over the place. But it really bothers me as being too on the nose. Again, it's part of that thing where I feel like they didn't trust their audience in this movie at all. Where you weren't supposed to get that she, was an old maid and that she's marrying him for money, for security, and all of this. And Charlotte's little speech that they wrote for her here is very different from what was in the book. And I really dislike the change in it. It makes her feel desperate, which I don't think Charlotte is desperate. I love Charlotte. She's a great character. And she expresses herself beautifully in the original novel. And this whole dumbing down again of the characterization, I don't like that they did that to her. I don't like I really just dislike this speech. It always rubs me the wrong way. It feels like History 101. It's hard for women out here in the 1790s. I don't know that we needed it spoon fed to us quite so much. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Feel free to fight me on this, but I really just dislike this version of Charlotte's speech. Then there's also Lydia's exposition of Darcy's the one who discovered us. So when she comes back after having been married, she's being her very Lydia self. And the picture I have of her here, she is actually wearing a bonnet, but her hair is awful. So, there's that. And so she's the one in this version, because they really cut out kind of the gardeners almost completely. We barely see the gardeners in this version, which again, I don't think it made it into my PowerPoint, but that is the thing I don't like because I love the gardeners. But in this version, the gardeners are very much gone. So Lydia is the one who reveals to Elizabeth that Darcy made the match. but she does it in such a way that it doesn't make sense to me for her character because Lydia wouldn't say it that way. Like she says it the way Mrs. Gardner explained it in the original novel. But that's because that's the way Mrs. Gardner sees it. Like Mrs. Gardner is the one who says, "Oh, he discovered them. He paid Wickham the money to force him to marry her and all of this." Lydia doesn't know that or see it that way. Lydia would only knew that, like that he showed up to the wedding, or she might have known maybe that he gave money, but like she would never have told Elizabeth that, "Oh yeah, Darcy forced Wickham to marry me." That's not how she sees it or understands it. So it makes absolutely no sense for her to say that and be all happy about it. Like, huh? Yeah, Darcy's the one who gave Wickham lots of money to force him to marry me. Like, no. Lydia doesn't see it that way, doesn't understand it that way. Like, it's just, why would Lydia say it that way? Like, even if you want Lydia to be the one to explain, to expose it, which they do something similar. I think in the novel, it is true that Lydia is the one who exposes that Mr. Darcy was there at the wedding, but she just says, "Oh, Mr. Darcy was at the wedding." And then Elizabeth has to follow up with the Mrs. Gardner to figure out exactly what went down behind the scenes. So they were trying to make that a little easier and have Lydia be the one to just expose everything, but it didn't work because Lydia doesn't see it that way, doesn't understand it that way, so she wouldn't say it that way. And again, it just bothers me. Why would Lydia say it like that? And back to Charlotte again. Again, I love Charlotte. She's one of my favorite characters. I hate that in this version they give Charlotte one of Mr. Collins's awful lines where they did again. I saw an interview of the director saying they did this on purpose because they wanted Charlotte to be happy with Mr. Collins, I guess, in this version. So they wanted to show her like getting into it and liking her life there, which I mean, I'm like, how dare you? Charlotte would never be in love with Mr. Collins. I think she made the right decision. I think she did a good job. I could do a whole video on defending Charlotte Lucas, and I might at some point. But so Charlotte is not the problem. Charlotte's amazing. But she would never be as socially inept as Mr. Collins. So to give her one of Mr. Collins's lines to say to Lizzie, and so the scene I'm specifically talking about is when Lizzie is visiting the Collinses in Kent and they're going to go see Lady Catherine for the first time. There's this awful scene where Mr. Collins goes on and on about how not to worry about what she's wearing because Lady Catherine is not so, wants people of lower birth to dress more poorly than her, and she likes to have the distinction of rank and whatnot. And so he has this whole speech that, like, in the book is horrifying and is an example of Mr. Collins being awful. And in this version, they split it up. And so Mrs. Collins, Charlotte, says part of that speech, the whole like, just put on whatever you've brought that is best. And uh, it's a dagger to the heart every time. Like, Charlotte would never. Charlotte could never. How dare you? The defamation of Charlotte Lucas in this movie is just unacceptable. And I will hear nothing of it. It's just bad. I hate it so much. Charlotte, again, would never. How dare you? So, my final thoughts on this movie. There are many, many things to nitpick, as I've already shown. I'm sure I'm forgetting things because, this is just the things that came up the top of my head when I was putting this together. As of a quick things, the things that really bother me about this movie, and I've shared some of them with you. There are probably more, but again, this is the thing. There are plenty of things to nitpick. And I also feel that this movie as a whole doesn't really make sense without outside context. I do think that you have to already kind of know the story for this version to make sense. I don't think that they explain enough about the Wickham situation or the entailment or the whole or why Mr. Collins is going to inherit the estate and blah 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 blah. I feel like so much of it is taken with the understanding that you already know all this or you will figure it out. And I just think that that's a silly way to make a movie. Like, you should be able to watch this movie and not have any other context and be okay with it. And I don't feel like that is how this movie works. I feel like you do need outside context for it to be successful. I also think this movie is too fast and too slow at the same time. Meaning there are portions of this movie that drag, in my opinion. We already talked about the pig scene that lasts forever. There's the scene where Lizzie is on the swing and just going round and round in circles as seasons go. It's very Twilight. I don't know when Twilight came out, whether that and or this that scene where you see Bella circling and the seasons changing versus this very similar scene where now where Lizzie is twirling and the seasons change. I don't know which one came first, but they are very similar scenes. Um, but that goes on for a long time. There are these sweeping shots and things. But then other aspects are just like boom, boom, boom. Like their dialogue is so fast and all over the place and on top of each other. The Wickham plot line is cut to the point of it almost doesn't even need to be there anymore because it's just barely there. The gardeners are almost completely cut out of this movie. They cut a bunch of other characters, you know. It's just I don't understand. It's just so they where they spent their time, I do not agree with, basically. And I will come back to with my positive sandwiching. Like I said at the beginning, it's still an enjoyable watch if you are able to throw it on and not really watch critically. The music's great, some of the scenery is amazing. I don't hate just having it on, especially as sort of background to other things that are going on, but I don't really enjoy watching it with a more critical eye because of all the things that I've just talked about nitpicking. But I'm not trying to claim that this movie is horrible and bad in all ways. It is not to my taste, and there's not much I can do about that. But if you love it, keep doing you, keep loving it. Again, the point of this is not to convince you to stop watching the movie and to think that it's horrible. The point is to point out and enjoy pointing out all the things that I think are wrong because I find that enjoyable, and that says nothing more about me than it does about you. So, in the end, here we go with Mr. Darcy yet again. As I talked about at the beginning, the hair of this movie, the hair of it all. He's a very handsome man, but this hair, oh my gosh, what are we doing? Just what are we doing? I hope you enjoyed this video. I might have other things I was talking about as far as especially in the defense of Charlotte Lucas. I love her. She's an amazing character. But as far as the 2005 movie goes, let me know. Am I completely wrong about all this? Do you agree with anything? Do you have other things you would nitpick that I missed? Let me know. Love to see it. And I will see you next time. Bye.